Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. According to flat earthers, the Earth is surrounded by an ice wall. But apparently we aren't allowed anywhere near the ice wall, and if you try and go there, you'll be intercepted by naval warships and probably never seen or heard from again. Except that would mean that the world's navies know the Earth is flat, and given that those ships are also used during wars as well, they would want their systems and equipment designed correctly based on a flat Earth. So in this video we're going to look how naval equipment and ship design is actually based on a globe. Much of this you could probably see for yourself by playing War Thunder. Head into battle in one of over 2,000 accurately modelled vehicles, including tanks, planes and even ships, which with the amazing damage systems and support for VR makes it the most comprehensive PvP vehicle combat game around. Personalise your vehicles with hundreds of camouflage and historical markings, and then dive into battle in up to stunning 4K graphics. I particularly like the fact that you don't need any extra hardware. Even pilots can play with just a mouse and keyboard thanks to the game's mouse aim mode. War Thunder is also entirely cross-platform compatible, so you can play against anybody on PC, PlayStation or Xbox. And whether you're signing up as a new player or previously played more than 6 months ago, for a limited time only use my link in the description to claim a large bonus pack that includes multiple premium vehicles, premium accounts and much more. So sign up today. Let's start with naval artillery. For centuries, ships' armaments would consist of short-range cannons that required ships to be within about 3,000 yards of each other. But by the end of World War II, there were ships like the US's South Dakota, North Carolina and Iowa-class battleships, which were hitting ranges of 23 nautical miles or more. And at long range, ships don't just point their guns directly at an enemy ship and fire. Instead, they have to spot the enemy target. The gun director will then use rangefinders to figure out what the line of sight distance is, as well as the heading and speed of the enemy ship, and what direction the enemy ship is away from their own ship. That information goes to a plotting room who will then plot a firing solution for their ship's guns. Because, for starters, if the guns were fired horizontal, then the shell would fall straight into the sea very quickly. So the guns have to be elevated and the shell fired in a ballistic trajectory. And at a range of 20 miles or more, the flight time of a shell is about 90 seconds. So if you had an enemy directly in front of you and they are sailing perpendicular to you at 20 knots, which is 23 miles an hour, and you point your gun straight at them and fire, then 90 seconds later when your shell finally lands, the enemy ship will have moved over half a mile away from where it was. So they include what is known as deflection, which is the angular difference between where the enemy is at the moment of firing versus where you want the shell to land. And ideally that'll be where the enemy is when that time comes. But at those sorts of flight times, Coriolis also becomes a problem as well. Here we have a table for the US 8-inch guns that were used extensively on cruisers during World War II, and these had a range of about 17 nautical miles, and this shows the amount of deflection that's caused by Earth's rotation based on the latitude that the ship is located, the distance that they're firing, and in what direction they're firing. Meaning a US cruiser in the Pacific in World War II could easily find themselves at 30 degrees latitude. If they were to come across, say, a Japanese Mugabe-class cruiser at 30,000 yards, they could be putting up to 112 yards of difference into where their shells are going to land. And the Mugabe-class were only 220 yards long to begin with, so they could be aiming for the middle of the ship and wind up barely hitting an end of it. Here is another document for the US 16-inch battleship guns, which addresses having to account for the Earth curvature. Because the fire control director will figure out the line of sight distance to an enemy ship, and then the plotting room will work out where the enemy ship is going to be, and so what elevation to fire the guns at to reach that particular distance, but the elevation of the guns is based on the horizontal of their own ship, i.e. at 0 degrees elevation the guns would be horizontal to their location. But on a globe, the horizontals of ships aren't parallel. So the plotters would have to factor in that and work out what the gun elevation needs to be based on that location. neither of which would need to be done if the Earth were a flat stationary plane, and neither of which you would want to do unnecessarily in a battle if your life depends on it. I've seen flat earthers try and claim that the new naval railguns prove that the Earth is flat because they can apparently shoot 100 miles line of sight.
The railgun is a question because it can shoot 100 miles and it's a line of sight weapon,
which simply isn't the case. For starters, line of sight requires you to physically see the target, and ships can't see ships 100 miles away. But railguns still fire physical projectile shells, much like conventional naval artillery. Once a shell leaves a barrel, it's still getting pulled down by gravity, so it has to be fired in a ballistic arc. The only difference is conventional artillery uses propellant behind the shell to create an explosion that forces the shell out of the gun. Railguns use electromagnets instead to propel the shell, which have two key advantages. The shell from a railgun can be fired at speeds of about 3,000 meters per second, whereas the US 16-inch naval battleship guns are fired at only 762 meters a second. That extra exit velocity is what allows railguns to be fired up to 100 miles versus 23 miles. Secondly, it means that ships don't have to carry around tons of explosive propellant, and you only need to look at the battles of Jutland or the Denmark Strait to see why that's a good thing. Now, I've also had flat earthers pull up some videos by Mark Where's the Curve Sergeant, who talked to a Sea Sparrow trainer in the US Navy who said he thought the Earth was flat because they don't need to correct for Earth curve when operating the Sea Sparrow. Except there's no reason why they would need to. The Sea Sparrow is a surface-to-air missile system, meaning it's fired from, say, ships at enemy planes. The early versions of it were guided using only semi-active radar homing, whereby the operator on the ship would point a target at an enemy aircraft, and that sent out a narrow beam signal. The signal would reflect off the plane, and the radar on the Sea Sparrow would pick up the signal and fly towards it. All of which is reliant on the person on board the ship physically seeing the plane. The latest version of the Sea Sparrow uses a mix of semi-active homing as well as active radar. This uses the ship's radar signal to get an initial fix on where to head for, and then once it gets close enough, it switches to active guidance and sends out its own signal to track down the enemy plane. Neither of which require any corrections for Earth curvature, since it's firing up into the air at a target that is constantly moving very quickly. Now, on the topics of radar and Earth curve, we come to a piece of equipment that would be totally pointless on a flat Earth. The E-2 Hawkeye. This is a carrier-based early warning radar aircraft. Now, radar works by sending out a radio signal that will reflect off any object it encounters, and if the reflected signal makes it back to the radar with sufficient strength, then the radar knows that there is something there. Which is very useful because it gives you time to prepare your actions. Radar was used to great effect during the Battle of Britain. The RAF were able to pick up enemy bombers 80 miles off the coast of the UK, which was about 30 minutes before the bombers reached their targets, so the RAF could know where and when to have fighters up in the air to meet the enemy. Now, like I said, radar needs a sufficient strength signal coming back to it. Every object reflects signal back, even birds, but the larger that an object is, the more that it will reflect, and operators can then estimate what an object is based on how big its radar signature is. It's how stealth aircraft get to hide, because they use special paint that absorbs a lot of the radar signal, so to a radar, it looks a lot smaller than they actually are, and so they're more likely to be mistaken for something irrelevant. But the range that a radar can detect something will be impacted by the size and the power of the radar itself. A more powerful signal can reach further, and a larger radar dish can capture more of that returning signal. The radar on naval ships can detect airborne targets up to 100 nautical miles away, but its surface detection range is significantly less, because the curve of the Earth gets in the way, creating what is called a radar horizon, which is why many naval fleets send up spotter aircraft to give the fleet more warning about incoming enemy ships. Then in the 1960s, the US began deploying the Hawkeye, which has a radar range of almost 300 nautical miles, allowing it to give significant warning of incoming threats, and why it's still used today. Why, if the Earth is flat? The USS Gerald R. Ford is the largest warship afloat at 100,000 tons. If the Earth were flat, it wouldn't need Hawkeyes because they could just strap a colossal radar dome on it and detect enemy ships when they were leaving the harbour. But they can't because no strength of radar can punch through the curve of Earth. Also telltale by the fact that the maximum range that a ship's radar can pick up aircraft is about 100 miles, yet the E-2 Hawkeye can pick up aircraft from 300 miles away, and in this photograph we can see E-2 Hawkeyes on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier, and we can see their radars are not significantly bigger than the ship's radar. Meaning, based on a flat Earth, the radar detection ranges of these should be fairly similar, not 3 times the difference. The only difference is the ship's radar is stuck near sea level, whereas the E-2 can get high up into the air to see further over the curve of Earth. While surface vessels and aircraft have radar which use radio waves, unfortunately radio waves can't travel very far underwater. So submarines will instead use sonar, which is the same basic principle, but instead it sends out sound waves and it listens to the echo coming back off objects. Very useful to make sure you aren't about to crash into something, since submarines can't physically see where they're going underwater. However, the problem of sending out sound waves is that then enemy submarines can also hear them, and they will hear your outgoing sound wave much clearer than you will hear the reflection off of their submarine.
Verify our range to target. 1 ping only. I'll be damned.
So in order to try and stay stealthy and avoid being detected, submarines will often utilise another method of underwater navigation, which also goes against flat Earth: gravity. To explain this method though, allow me to hand over to a friend of mine who's had first-hand experience with this while serving on board active naval submarines. Fellow flat Earth debunker, fight the flat Earth. Over to you, Craig.
Hey, I'm FTFE and I'm from the channel that does to stupidity what gravity does to the flat Earth. Thanks very much to Dave for lowering his standards enough to allow me to come on and talk to you about how submarines use gravity to navigate underwater to help them stay stealthy and not crash into underwater mountains. Gravity creates a force that is proportional to the product of two masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between the massive centers. Okay, all right. That is just a really fancy way of saying that two perfect spheres will create a force between them that's influenced both by how big they are and how far apart from each other they are. For two perfect spheres, this force will be the same no matter the orientation of those spheres to each other. But Earth is not completely uniform. There are mountains and valleys, lakes and oceans with varying topography, and this means that at its core, the Earth's gravitational field created by Earth's mass also isn't uniform. For instance, you will have more mass underneath you if you were standing at the top of Everest than you would if you were at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. This difference in gravitational force over a short distance is termed as a gravity gradient, and submarines can detect these gradients using an array of highly sensitive accelerometers. This is a relatively new technology, and it's important for a number of reasons. Traditional methods like GPS and even sonar can be unreliable due to deep waters blocking signals like radio waves from traveling. The Earth's varying gravitational field has been extensively mapped. So by comparing these known mappings with real-time measurements, submarines are able to pinpoint their exact location without having to surface and give away the location by using noisy methods like sonar. As the boat moves through Earth's gravitational field, the accelerometers on board react to the difference in forces around them, which gives them a real-time indication of the underwater topography. It's just like using a map on the surface and comparing your position to known landmarks or geological features. Is it worth it? Well, yes, the advantages are pretty clear: stealth and autonomy. Submarines using this can remain submerged for longer than normal without the need to surface for GPS fixes, and this is really important for military submarines that prioritize being really stealthy. Of course, with this technology, like any technology, there's challenges. The method requires extremely accurate gravity maps, and the submarine's own movements, like sudden changes in speed or depth, can introduce errors. Other things like underwater seismic activity can affect the readings, as these happen more often than gravitational gradient mapping does. The pioneers of this technology have been the institute I was proud to serve for many years, the Royal Navy. And they keep on pushing this technology to its limits. Recently, they've been testing using a much more advanced method of gravity gradient detection using a Bose-Einstein condensate in place of normal accelerometers. This would enable a much more accurate and detailed real-time mapping. So if gravity isn't real, why are we bothering doing this? Gravity gradient navigation done by submarines brings all the knowledge we have of both gravity and engineering together to create a useful real-world technology that is used every single day. Gravity straight out kills the flat earth. That's why flat earthers have to deny its existence. Thanks for having me on, Dave, and if you guys watching would like to see any more of me, then you've probably got an issue, but if you would really like to, then head over to my channel and watch me give myself regular brain damage by debating flat earthers. See you around.
Thanks for that, Craig. I will leave a link to FTFE's channel below. If you haven't seen him before, I highly recommend checking him out. He should be having a video out soon which carries this on by looking at other aspects of military equipment that uses a globe, where I should be making an appearance as well. Before we wrap this video up though, let's for a moment consider where every ship design insists on putting equipment like radar. High up on the superstructure, along with fire control systems, along with radio antennas, and where ships for centuries put people in crow's nests as lookouts. Because the higher they are, the better their visibility is over the curve of Earth. Bear in mind that if the Earth were flat, then militaries would want the complete opposite. Because every ship you ever see appear comes into view top first. So the taller that a ship is, the further away it's going to be visible to the enemy lookouts, who are themselves quite high up. No military wants to make their equipment intentionally more vulnerable to being spotted than is necessary. If the Earth is flat, then ship designers in World War II wouldn't have put conning towers dozens of feet higher in the air for all to see. Seems counterintuitive to go through the hassle of painting ships with dazzle camouflage to make them harder to track, whilst simultaneously making them easier to spot by being unnecessarily tall, just for appearance's sake in trying to hide the shape of the Earth. Would have made far more sense to remove those and significantly reduce the profile of the ship and thus how far away it could be spotted by the enemy. That, I think, is going to conclude this video though. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this. Don't forget to check out that amazing sign-on bonus using the link below. Thanks as well to FTFE for helping out. If you've enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.